Hi, I'm Jayne Moore Waldrop, and I am so pleased to have the opportunity to be here at the McCracken County Public Library for this program about my new book, Drowned Town. I am a Paducah native, have wonderful memories of always coming to the library in Paducah, so it's especially meaningful to me to make this connection today. As I said, I'm a Paducah native. Went to Lone Oak High School, left for college at the University of Kentucky, and studied English and journalism, came back and was a reporter and editor at the Paducah Sun for about 4 years, then went to law school. And when I left for law school, after I graduated, I lived in Louisville and practiced law and in Frankfort. Our family moved to Lexington about 15 years ago, so kind of know a lot of different parts of the state. So I want to talk to you about why I wrote this book, Drowned Town. As they say, you should always write, as a fiction writer, you should always write what you know. And I know Western Kentucky well, I feel, since I lived here for most of my life. But I felt like I knew the history just around the edges. I wanted a deeper understanding of the enormous and monumental changes that occurred in Western Kentucky in the mid-20th century. And those changes came from the creation, the building of Kentucky Dam, Barkley Dam, and the creation of the Land Between the Lakes. Those were monumental changes. One thing I wanted to mention also is that after I'd practiced law for many years, I decided I really wanted to become a fiction writer. So I enrolled in the low residency MFA program at Murray State University and completed that program. And just sort of at midlife, changed the direction, my professional direction. And I have 2 books of poetry, and Drowned Town is my first book of fiction. I want to talk to you about why I wrote the book. A decade ago, I walked the shoreline of Old Catawba in Western Kentucky on a clear December afternoon, the time of year when the Lake Barkley's water level is at its lowest. Winter pool, they call it. A controlled lowering of this Cumberland River reservoir that straddles the Kentucky and Tennessee line. The drawdown at the massive concrete dam a few miles downstream reduces the likelihood of flooding from winter and spring rains. Each year when the water goes down, signs of the past reveal themselves. Beaches broaden, banks grow taller, and favorite water skiing bays become shallow and riskier to navigate as sandbars and other obstructions appear. Like the towboat captains who navigate the lake year-round, seasoned boaters know to stay within the confines of the marked, twisting channel to keep from running aground. The sun offered short daylight hours that day and little warmth, and as it approached the horizon, its beams skirted across the water, then dropped behind the low hills that ring the lake. The gloaming tinted layers of sky, earth, and water, from orange to pink to deep magenta, as egrets and herons found their spots for the night. Along the exposed shore and in the day's last light, I witnessed the outlines of house foundations, fragments of old roads, scattered bricks, even railroad spikes where the railroad station once sat. The view haunted me. It still does. The drowned towns and the many lost places felt close, their histories not so distant. This landscape underwent monumental changes when Kentucky and Barkley dams were built a half-century before, when old river towns were demolished prior to the impoundments, and the area now known as Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area was deconstructed. I grew up in Western Kentucky, and I've always loved the lakes and LBL. I knew the history, but I had no familial connections to the areas, to the sites that were impacted. Until that December day when I witnessed traces of what had been existing in Catawba before the lake. I hadn't considered the profound personal sacrifices of the people who gave up home places, communities, and livelihoods to make way for these projects. As you know, we're in this far tip of Kentucky in an area now called the Kentucky's Western Waterlands. That's the new tourism designation for this area, to include both lakes, LBL, Paducah and its arts community. And you know, Kentucky's such a long state that there are a lot of people in the rest of the state who don't come all the way to this little tip of Kentucky, and that's their loss, in my opinion. You can see here how this picture is the current day arrangement of the lakes, the highways, how this part of the state looks. And this is a map that shows before the lakes were built. You know, this is a place of rivers. Those rivers, and I've marked them probably too big for the map, but you know, we've got the Tennessee on the left, to its east, the Cumberland going into the Ohio, Paducah and Smithland. Here's a 1956 map that shows the ballooning of Kentucky Lake from the Tennessee River. You can see that the Cumberland River remains a river, and I guess the between the rivers area, that peninsula that is between the Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers, is it's not a place between lakes yet. It's one lake and one river. And this shows the enlargement of both rivers when they were impounded by the dams, and then the designation for Land Between the Lakes. And here we go. This is today's view. So, it is a beautiful place, but as time passes, one of my goals was to not let this history disappear. There are several excellent nonfiction books about the history of both dams being constructed and the taking of property that became Land Between the Lakes. And because there are good books that record that history, that was not my goal. You know, I'm a fiction writer, so I wanted to get the history correct, to make my historical fiction accurate, but I wanted to capture perhaps a bigger picture that would include the emotional impact of these takings and this dislocation for so many people. The western tips of Kentucky and Tennessee are places of rivers, big rivers. The region is bounded by the Mississippi, the Ohio, and the Cumberland, then sliced again for good measure by the Tennessee. In the mid-20th century, the area became a place of lakes, big lakes, when the topography was forever altered by a succession of major federal water and land projects: Kentucky Dam, Barkley Dam, and LBL. Before the lakes, a narrow strip of land situated between the Tennessee and the Cumberland was known as Between the Rivers, where the people lived in small towns or on family farms. Many were descendants of settlers who arrived in the early 1800s after the region became part of the United States during the westward push for new territory. The original 1818 government buyout for this part of Kentucky was negotiated through treaties with the Chickasaw Indians, who had also called this place home. Kentucky Dam came first. It was constructed between 1938 and 1944. Let's see here. Oh. There we go. And it was part of the New Deal's plan for rural electrification and flood control through the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA. The Tennessee River was dammed near the small town of Gilbertsville in Marshall County. The resulting reservoir, Kentucky Lake, still the largest lake in surface area in the eastern United States, and the largest body of water between the Gulf of Mexico and the Great Lakes. Stretches 184 miles and covers more than 160,000 acres. The lake opened the Tennessee Valley to year-round navigation and connected the region to the inland waterway. The dam and reservoir displaced thousands of residents and submerged several towns, but a significant diaspora did not occur in the region. Most people relocated nearby. Some moved from the banks of the Tennessee to homes on the Cumberland if they wanted to remain river people, while others moved to between the rivers. Several families were displaced multiple times by the public projects that followed. In fact, less than 20 years after Kentucky Dam was built, and a mere 2 miles away from Kentucky Dam, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers completed Barkley Dam on the Cumberland River. Again, an enormous reservoir filled to create Lake Barkley, named for Paducah favorite son and former U.S. Vice President Alben Barkley, the original Veep. Eddyville and Catawba were relocated to nearby higher ground and rebuilt as new towns. The old towns were then demolished in preparation for the higher water levels. A few original houses remain at both sites, as well as the Kentucky State Penitentiary, perched close to a limestone bluff in Old Eddyville. So the old towns, I think this picture is 1930-ish. Catawba was also known for its Mineral Springs Hotel. It was a big tourist draw to come and take the waters and do the mineral baths. Train depot, the business district. It was just like any other small, bustling river town. Eddyville. This is an aerial view before the lake was built. So you can see how narrow and winding the river is there. It really meanders through Lyon and Trigg County, especially Lyon County. The Eddyville Business District, obviously a bustling county seat. It's where you went to transact your business at the courthouse. But one of the things about this area is that flooding was an important, flood control was an important goal. And then one of the main reasons the dams were built, to control that, those seasonal floods. And of course, here in Paducah, you know, the 1937 flood was devastating here also. Well, it was also in Catawba and Eddyville, all along the rivers. So there's that same train station in the floodwaters. And in Eddyville. So they were devastating floods. And This is Eddyville's appropriately named Water Street. It was the one that ran down to the ferry, but it was often flooded. So, this was the construction of Barkley Dam. And even before this project was finished, another project was announced. In 1963, President Kennedy announced a plan to create a national recreation area to be known as Land Between the Lakes. The plan would return the Between the Rivers area to a wild, natural state to attract visitors for camping, hunting, hiking, and other recreational activities. To accomplish this, every house, farm, business, school, and church had to be acquired by TVA through the government's power of eminent domain. Each parcel would be cleared, every structure demolished, and most signs of human settlement erased. The federal government already owned a 57,000-acre portion of the peninsula known as Between the Rivers, a tract known as the Kentucky Woodlands National Wildlife Refuge. But the LBL project required more land. Residents protested and fought to keep their property, but in the end, the government took it all, over 170,000 acres. More than 800 families were moved out. So this is a picture of the Eddyville deconstruction. So that would have been late 1959 into 63. And that's just for the dam. There's a picture of the old Eddyville School as it's being taken down. And Eddyville and Catawba, as new towns, were built on higher ground. Some homes were moved from the old towns to a new place that's not going to flood, either in one of the new towns or in another piece of ground somewhere. A man named Lee Jones actually helped set up the town of Eddyville, the new town of Eddyville, donated the land, and people could get free lots in New Eddyville if they, promised to build there. So in order to attract people to another town, which also the county seat was moved to New Eddyville, so people got their free lots and started construction. And this gets into the deconstruction and the many lost communities between the rivers. Golden Pond was the largest town on the peninsula on the Kentucky side. There's an aerial view. A lot of people lived there. Model, Tennessee was also razed, and everyone moved out. Tharp, Tennessee also. There were many landmarks between the rivers. Mary Major's restaurant was legendary. It later moved over to New Catawba, between Catawba and Eddyville. And that's the Twin Lakes restaurant. There's a bay and a campground known as Twin Lakes. The Sardis community, which you don't hear that name very often anymore. The TVA Land Acquisition Office was in Golden Pond. That's pictured on the left. Most of the town was in the process of being razed at that point. And then there were protests by Between the Rivers landowners, as you can see in the picture on the right. They even took their case through the federal court system, but I don't think the Supreme Court heard that case. But because the project was considered to be in the public interest, there was the right of eminent domain to condemn the property and pay the landowners for their property, but they had to move. There's no question that electrification of this rural part of the country sparked dramatic economic growth and provided thousands of good-paying jobs at new chemical and industrial plants. There's no doubt the region needed reliable river navigation and flood control, especially after the devastation of the catastrophic 1937 flood and other frequent but significant flooding. The lakes drove a wave of development that attracted tourists to the recreational opportunities of boating, fishing, and swimming, and paved the way for increased tax revenues that lifted towns, counties, and school districts out of poverty. But there was a price to be paid for progress, and here some folks paid dearly. When Kentucky Lake filled in the 1940s, the former bustling town of Birmingham disappeared beneath its surface. To make way for Lake Barkley, Eddyville, and Catawba were demolished in the 1960s. Farmhouses along both rivers were knocked down and fertile bottomlands submerged. By 1970, nearly every Between the Rivers resident had been moved out, and the communities of Golden Pond, Model, and Tharp were torn down. In isolation, each project brought significant change, but collectively, the environmental and social impact was enormous. Kentucky has few natural lakes, but 43 constructed reservoirs dot our landscape. Communities in every part of the state have their own stories of drowned towns and lost places, including Lake Cumberland, Dale Hollow, Rough River, Green River, Nolan, and Taylorsville Lake, to name a few. In the region, major reservoirs include Pickwick, Lanier, Old Hickory, Percy Priest, Norris, and Fontana. The history of these projects and our march toward progress are inextricably linked to the sacrifices of those who can never go home again. So, that's the historical background, and I want to, next I'm going to read you from the book. I want you to get a sense of how I took the history and turned it into, use that as the setting and the circumstances, and oops. Well, I'll have a few more pictures from Between the Rivers. This was the Marlar home in Land Between the Lakes, or Between the Rivers. It's very near the river. It was built by a riverboat captain. This was 1961, so it was still occupied. And, you know, for some reason that house, or parts of that house still stands, and it's a kind of famous landmark in Land Between the Lakes. This is the way Golden Pond looks today. 6880 goes through there. There is, I think, an important attraction there, the Golden Pond overlook, that you can get an idea of how the town was laid out. And St. Stephen's Church. This is near Mammoth Furnace. And St. Stephen's sat neglected and nearly forgotten by most people. Once, really, I think actually it was when Barkley was built, because the road to St. Stephen's was flooded as the water came up and cut off the road to it. It was an old Catholic parish. It had already been abandoned long before the LBL project was approved. So no one thought about it when it was time to purchase land. I think it was on one family's farm. I think they were paid for their farm, but somehow the church, no one really thought about it. No one noticed it, probably because the roads were cut off to it. It sat there until, I think, the late 1990s, and a group of former residents from Between the Rivers asked the Forest Service if they could restore it and save it, because it was hanging on by a thread. It was nearly off its foundation, and completely neglected for half a century. So they have restored it with an amazing effort from these former residents at volunteer hours. But it's a beautiful place. If you've never been there, I encourage you to go. It's a very special place, and it's very sacred to many people, since it's one of the only original and intact buildings now from the Between the Rivers era. So I'm going to read. Oh, and I have to say, St. Stephen's is in my book. It's an important setting for the book. I'm going to read from the first chapter, Dry Ground. Cam wandered through this uninhabited place, remembering each house and family and tree that had been here before the water came. She stumbled, nearly turning an ankle, as she crossed a disintegrating asphalt slab, a remnant of the street where she had lived in a town that once existed. She glanced in both directions, more from childhood habit than necessity. Since there were no cars left, there was nothing left, only a few shards of brick and stone, a faint curvature of sky and earth that felt vaguely familiar. Her mother's unsealed wedding dress had made her feel nostalgic and drawn back to the old town. The ecru lace gown, preserved with care for future generations in a heavy cardboard box, had been brought out and altered to fit Cam. The wedding, her second, Owen's first, was in 3 days. She and Owen had been friends since childhood when they both lived in this old town. Cam had been slow to see him as anything but a buddy and hesitant about marrying again, but this time made sense, she thought. Now in their 40s, surely they knew what they were getting into. That morning she had met with the seamstress for a final fitting. The waistline had been let out a bit, the shoulders taken in, torn lace repaired in a few spots. In the small, cluttered tailor shop, she slipped the dress on and looked at herself in a three-way mirror. "How does it feel?" the seamstress asked as she zipped up the back and tugged at the neckline. "Like I've stepped back in time," Cam said, thinking about the framed wedding picture that had been on her parents' bedside table for as long as she could remember. Her mother wore the same dress in the photograph, her satin slingback pumps shining beneath the tea-length hem. The black and white photo had been snapped in 1955 as the smiling young bride and groom descended the steep concrete steps of the Eddyville First Methodist Church. And now, 50 years later, Cam looked in the mirror and thought the dress made her look younger too. She was smiling as she left the shop, pleased with how the gown had turned out, but drawn to the place in the photograph. For the last few months, she had focused on the future, whether to get married, what kind of wedding suited them. But today the past pulled at her. She ignored the list of errands in her pocket and decided to drive to the old town. She still remembered the way. The two-lane highway dead-ended at a lonesome knoll overlooking Lake Barkley. Cam parked in a grassy area beside the road and walked toward what used to be Water Street, the hilly one that ended at the ferry landing. The broad lake sparkled in the midday sun. The sky was bright and cloudless. She watched as a large cabin cruiser, better suited for the ocean than an inland waterway, powered its way through the narrow, twisting channel marked by red and green navigation buoys. The marker served as both a reminder and a warning that the Cumberland River's deep channel still provided the safest passage on a lake that appeared vast but could be deceptively shallow in places. The cruiser spread an oversized wake that rocked nearby fishing boats and caused the captain of a slow, scruffy pontoon boat to swerve at a defensive angle to keep from getting swamped. A lone bronze marker revealed the spot's history as the former site of Eddyville, a thriving town settled near a series of bends on the Cumberland River, which snakes a course through the middle of the country, from mountains to barrens to rolling hills. The plaque told the the town's role in American history as an outpost on the western frontier, as an important junction during the Civil War, as a commercial center and county seat. The tarnished words also described mid-century government projects for flood control, hydroelectric power, and tourism when the flowing river was dammed. The sign memorialized U.S. presidents, vice presidents, and governors from Kentucky and Tennessee, but failed to mention the people who had lived in the town and had given up their homes as the giant lake rose. They had been told their sacrifice was for the public good. They were never told how much they would miss it or for how long. So I want to talk a little bit about the structure of the book. This part of the book, the current action, explores a friendship between two friends. One is from Eddyville, old Eddyville. It's Cam. She has a good friend, Margaret, who is her complete opposite. They are they have a yin and yang kind of relationship and balance each other out with their personality traits. Margaret is from Louisville. They've known each other from college. Both have experienced loss, and loss is an important theme in the book. Some of the other, I think, themes of the book that the place is very important. I intentionally wanted to make it a key theme because, you know, there aren't that many books written about Western Kentucky, and it seems, and especially not fiction. There's a lot of history books and nonfiction, but there's not a lot of fiction. Of course, Bobby Ann Mason is sort of a master of fiction writing, and her books are often set in Western Kentucky. But I wanted to talk about this place, and place in a bigger sense too, because one character is from Louisville. Place is important in her story too. Loss of home and the sense of loss runs throughout the book. And that loss takes many forms, whether that's loss of home and loss of place, loss of community. I have characters woven throughout the book. Loss of freedom. I have a prisoner in the Kentucky State Penitentiary who is watching as the old town of Eddyville is deconstructed and as the waters begin to rise for the lake. I have one resident between the rivers who is visited by the appraiser who must give his property a value. And it's a real moment of enlightenment for the appraiser. And I think because there is a lot of loss, one other major character is also begins showing signs of dementia. So there's another form of loss. And from those themes of loss, the grieving process becomes an important part of this book, whether that's for a place or a person or one's freedom. I think grief is an important part of transformation, and transformation has occurred here in Western Kentucky with these projects. The geography, the topography, things are so different from the beginning of the construction of Kentucky Dam. So the theme of loss, as I said, continues with loss of freedom. I'm going to read another short section from View from Within. Every morning before breakfast lineup, men on heavy equipment return to their work of demolishing the old town within view of Lester Elliott's cell. With the new lake rising, lapping above its ancient riverbanks, they labored with a new fury, even working weekends to finish the job. The sounds of front-end loaders and excavators came through open windows in the prison's thick stone walls, windows shaped like narrow slots designed for ventilation, not escape. The noise bothered some of the inmates, who complained they couldn't sleep for all the ruckus, but not Lester. He had always been an early riser, and he liked watching life outside. From his cell on the 3rd floor of the penitentiary, which itself rose high on a bluff above the town and river, Lester looked through his tiny slot window, the view unobstructed by mountains or trees. Across the river stood a big brick house, the only house opposite among the vast bottomland that stretched for miles. As a crow might fly across the broad and open sky, the house was directly across the Cumberland from his cell. Years ago, when Lester first arrived, a guard had told him that the distant setting was called Mint Springs, a small community situated on a narrow strip of land known as Between the Rivers, bordered by the Tennessee on the west and the Cumberland on the east. And year after year, as he served his sentence, he watched the house as seasons unfolded, as members of the farm family or field hands worked the land. To Lester, the place was like a dream, a mirage he was unlikely to reach. So the book is a novel in stories. So each story is a freestanding piece. So it's a literary style, linked short stories or a novel in stories is usually what they're called. Some of my favorite ones are Olive Kittredge and Olive Again. Each chapter is truly a freestanding story. Winesburg, Ohio is another one, another famous linked story collection. And the reason I used that structure was because I wanted to tell different stories from around the lakes, from between the rivers, different aspects of these changes. So that's how I decided to do it. It's kind of it's an unusual form actually, but I thought it worked for the many stories that needed to be told and the many voices who needed to be represented. One of the things, I do not have a familial connection to the lakes area. My family is originally from Appalachia. They moved to Paducah before I was born. So we also had a dislocation in our family that perhaps I feel empathetic for loss of home. Paducah has always been my home. My parents were very happy here. They never moved back to Eastern Kentucky during their lifetime. But I think they yearned for home and longed for that. Home was in the mountains for them. And I have a sense that, it's very difficult to ever get over that loss of home, even when you go on to, have a good life somewhere else. That dislocation is an emotional component for generations. So I wanted to explore that, but on the Western Kentucky story. Let's see. Almost forgot about the rest of my slides. And there is the site of Old Eddyville, which that's the lone bronze marker. The drowned towns, of course, are those towns that are either completely submerged or partially submerged. This is on the shore in Old Catawba. They're obviously a brick foundation. This is Old Catawba. Again, more foundations. This picture was taken, I think in early November, so the water was pretty low. They start drawing down the water levels after the 4th of July. So it's continually, bringing it down to hopefully avoid flooding. And this was on the Eddyville shoreline, which to me is particularly evocative of what used to be there. In the process of writing this book and its publication, I have come into contact, and my research also. I will say my research just depended on the availability of libraries and archival documents and old newspapers and digital collections that could help me research this history. And also the photographs that were stored at Murray State, they documented every home and structure, or they have the archives, every structure from Land Between the Lakes that was torn down. And it is a very evocative also collection. And I think I could reach my goal of representing the human element in this loss. So I've come into contact with lots of people who say, I grew up in Old Eddyville, or I grew up in Catawba. I grew up in between the rivers. And I think for each, there's that yearning for home that they voice. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that loss. I heard from someone who wrote me a note, and I want to read that because I think it's important for all of us to acknowledge the sacrifice that an important group of people paid in Western Kentucky, all in the name of public good. And there are lots of benefits from these projects. Some of the people who lived this loss and displacement have been in contact with me. The other day I received this note from retired Kentucky Supreme Court Justice Bill Cunningham, who spent his first 16 years in Old Eddyville. And this is his quote. I'm just reading it verbatim. "My grandfather, my father, and myself, we lost our land to the lakes. I'm touched by your whole work, the stories of the various people and families intertwined, but nothing more moving for me than on your acknowledgement page. Thank you for the sacrifices made on our behalf and in the public interest. After 75 years, you are the first to say thanks." So I really appreciated that note from him, and I hope that if you read this book or watch this program, I hope that you will consider the changes that this group of people have lived through, still have memories of, and acknowledge that and perhaps express appreciation for all that was done in the name of the public good. Thank you so much for having me here. As I said, libraries mean so much to me and always have, from early childhood at the old Carnegie Library that burned when I was really young. It's one of my first memories, was going and checking out books. I still remember the book I checked out. So like I said, I have a real tender spot for the library. And by the way, it was Where the Wild Things Are. Thank you very much.